This build guide is for the abong gear and cam switch kit. You can build this kit to fit either a toggle switch or a rocker switch, and all the parts you need to adapt to either are included. There's a few steps that are slightly different, and we'll point them out throughout the video. There's a few supplies you'll need before you begin. 150 grit sandpaper, which is for coarse sanding. 220 grit sandpaper, which is for fine sanding, gives you a nice smooth surface with low friction. And you're going to want a gel type super glue. The one I'm using is by Gorilla, and I like it because it stays exactly where you place it. It's got a nice fine applicator nozzle, so it only goes where you want it to go. And it takes about 10 seconds to bond, so you've got a little bit of time to get the parts in alignment before the glue sets. There are a lot of other brands out there, and by all means feel free to choose one. When the kit's done, you'll need a 4-inch flathead screwdriver to remove the old switch plate and install your new one. It helps if it's magnetized, but it's not necessary. We're almost ready to get into it, I promise. I just have 2 more really quick points. First, when you're directed to sand parts, sand them thoroughly. Remove all the blemishes, all the marks, all the roughness, because sanding those parts actually reduces them just a little bit in thickness, and that allows parts that slide past each other to move a little bit easier and makes for a smoother moving switch, so the kit works better when it's finished. Second, take care with the glue. Make sure that you're placing it only where it's intended to go. You use it sparingly, so place enough on there so it coats the surface of the part, but not too much so that when you press the parts together, a lot of glue squeezes out from the joint. Because if it does get in contact with parts that move, it can bond them and seize up your switch. Also, you want to be careful because the glue does bond skin. So if you can stick your fingers together, you can get parts stuck to your fingers. So just be cautious with it. So let's get going. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove some of the parts from the boards that we don't want to sand. So we want to leave these parts just a little bit thicker so that it allows that space that we were talking about. So the parts that we sand are going to be a little bit thinner, and these parts that we remove are going to be just a little bit thicker. So the parts that we're removing here are some of the axle parts and a slider part. So we'll just get those and we'll set those aside off to the side. And if parts pop out, just set them back in before you move on to the sanding step. Now on to the sanding. I'm going to use 150 grit sandpaper. And you can see here I'm using a sanding block. It's just a chunk of wood that you wrap the sandpaper around. It makes sanding a flat surface a lot easier. So I'm working in circles and working the entire surface of the board from corner to corner, making sure that each part has no more residue on it, no rough edges, and you can see the difference between a fully sanded board and one that's not. So do make sure you sand both the front and the back of each sheet and all of the parts. The total time to sand both boards front and back was probably a little under 10 minutes here. So we'll clean up, get rid of some of the sawdust, and if sawdust bothers you, by all means use a mask. In this step, we're going to form the box that makes up part of the base. It uses parts B and C, so just remove them from the carrier board. Right? And then look on the side pieces and make sure that you are aware of the orientation of the arrows. They have to go in the same direction. And the end pieces, it really doesn't matter which way you glue them in. They can be upside down, left, right, front to back. It doesn't really matter. They're symmetrical. So, and the rest is just a pattern. The inside is just a pattern. So whatever you think is more appealing, by all means go ahead. So we've put a little bit of glue on, and we're going to press the parts together and make sure that they're fully engaged. Now we'll move on to the next end part, and just a little bit of glue. and we'll press that part in as well. And you can see there's no gap or seam, and we can move on to the other side. So we'll put a little piece of glue or a little bit of glue on all the end parts, and then we'll press the other side piece on. First, checking to make sure that the arrows are aligned with the arrow on the other side. And we'll press it in. And we've completed the box for the base. Next, we're going to glue the backing plate, part D, onto the box that we've made. So just pop the part out of the carrier board, remove that inner piece. Depending on which type of switch you're making, you may need those pieces later. Just set them aside. And we'll just make sure that it fits onto the box correctly. So the tabs have to press all the way through. And again, you can orient this backing plate however you wish, whatever you think looks the best. So we're just going to apply a bead of glue on all the edge parts. And I apologize here, it's a little bit out of the frame, but we're just applying the glue around the edge as indicated on the instructions. And now we'll just press that plate into place. And again, making sure that all the parts are fully engaged and pressed completely down. Next up, we're going to glue the mounting plate onto the back of the backing plate. And depending on whether you're building for a toggle switch or a rocker switch, you're going to use part E or F. So in this case, we're going to work with a rocker switch, so we're going to use the one with the bigger hole. So you can glue it straight onto the back. And the larger holes in this part are just for clearance on the actual switch on the wall, so they don't align with anything else in the part. The round holes at the top and the bottom. The small holes should be centered over the holes in the backing plate. So that's pressed into place. And that's the mounting box. All right, in step 6, we're going to build the actuator. So we start with part G, and that's whether you're building for a rocker or a toggle switch. And because I'm doing a rocker type switch, I'm going to use parts I. So they are the ones that go on for the rocker switch. If I was going to do a toggle switch for this one, I would use the part G and part H. So, and they would match the backing plate that we put on. So the first thing we're going to do is just glue these two parts together. And it's important to get them well aligned. So make sure that all edges of them are completely aligned. So before the glue sets, just make sure that you've got a nice flat surface to glue it to the actuator plate G. So a little bit of glue on the back here. And we'll press that into part G. And make sure you got a nice snug fit on both sides. And this is what's actually going to come into contact with the light switch. So with the base of the actuator done, we're going to sand the rest of the parts that make up the actuator to make sure that they slide smoothly in the slot. So we're going to start with the slider piece and just sand all the edges of it. Remove all the residue, and you're using 220 grit sandpaper here, which is a finer sandpaper. So you got a nice clean edge. And now we'll do the face and the edge of the actuator base. And just taking off a little bit of the edge so that it slides smoothly and doesn't catch on the underside of the top plate later. And now you also want to sand the part that actually comes into contact with the switch, just to make sure that it slides easily. And finally, we're going to take one of the axle pieces and just remove all of the residue from the edge. And you can see here a sanded piece versus a non-sanded piece. All right, so now we can put that part together. So now we're going to glue two of the locator tabs that we took out in step 1 onto the back of the slider piece. So go really easy on the glue here. You just need a tiny dab. This is just to position it against the other plate. So this isn't a structural piece at all. You just need a tiny dab of glue. So you'll put one locator tab in each of the square holes at the end. And just make sure it's it's nice and straight. And here we'll do the other one. And press it in fully and make sure it's straight. And then we'll glue that part onto the actuator. So just apply a little bit of glue here. Again, you don't want it to squeeze out. You want just enough glue so that it makes a good bond. So we'll press that in. And again, it has to sit completely flat. There it goes. So if there was any glue, you can wipe it off. And it's really important that this part slides easily. So I'm just going to sand the face of it a little bit. And that part's ready. Finally, we're going to glue the sanded axle piece onto the actuator using the L piece. It looks like one of the locator tabs, but it has a longer T part to it. You can see the difference here. So it glues the same way as the locator tab, just a little bit of glue. And we'll press the axle part, the sanded one, onto that. And then we can immediately glue that piece onto the actuator. So you want to go easy here on the glue. You don't want a lot of glue, just enough to hold it all together. And make sure it's pressed completely into place and that there's no glue that's squeezed out. If any does, just clean it up and remove it with either a scrap piece of wood or a piece. So before we move on here, we're going to sand parts Q and J, which is the top plate and the cam follower. And these two parts slide against each other and are some of the primary moving parts. So we're going to sand both faces of them and the slots using 220 grit sandpaper. So work carefully over the whole surface of both parts, front and back, and then roll up the sandpaper and remove all the residue and any of the rough edges from inside the slot. So the laser cutting process leaves tiny little ridges, and that can cause a lot of friction when you're trying to operate the switch later. So that's why it's important to remove that residue and those rough edges with the 220 grit sandpaper here. So that's the slot in the plate, and you can see there on the close-up that there's no residue left, and it's a nice smooth edge. So we'll do the same thing with the cam follower, and it's a curved slot there, and the actuator sits in that curved slot. So I'll just re-roll my sandpaper here to get a nice tight fit in there. And then just work it along the edge of the slot. So you want to get all the edges of it, front and back, and the corners, and just twisting it in the corner a little bit, working it back and forth, and you'll get a nice smooth finish. So again, take your time here. It only took 4 or 5 minutes to get this completely prepped for the next step. So we'll just clean up the workbench here, get rid of some of the sawdust, and we're ready to move on. So part 13, we're going to glue a locator tab onto the back of one of the axle pieces. So you only need enough glue here to hold it in place. This isn't a structural part. It's just to locate that axle onto the part J. So now that we've got the locator tab on, we can add a little bit of glue on both sides of the locator tab on the axle. And we'll press that into the marked side, so the side that has the off and on of part J. And make sure it's pressed completely in, and check that no glue has seeped out from the edge. Next, we're going to glue part K onto the back of another axle piece. So part K looks a lot like a locator tab, but it's got a little thicker base. So just make sure you're picking the right part. And again, just enough glue to hold it to the axle while we glue it onto part J. If your glue bottle gets clogged, a good way to unclog it is with a simple paper clip. So here we go, we'll press this on. And now we can immediately glue that onto part J. So we'll add a little bit of glue. And again, you want to make sure that you're gluing it onto the same side that you glued that other axle piece onto. And I've got a little bit of glue that's seeped out here, so I'm just going to remove it using one of the scrap pieces here. Just scraping the extra glue away. I don't recommend using your fingers to check for excess glue, by the way. So onto the back of part J, we're going to glue part S. And part S is in a triangular shaped carrier board that's in the middle of the faceplate. So you can just break that whole triangular piece away and break part S out of that. Now you'll notice part S has a marked side. It's got a ring around the edge, and that just shows where the glue can go. So apply glue inside the mark, and we'll just press that onto the back of part J. The round part goes to the top, the flat part goes to the bottom. Next, we're going to glue the 4 of the spacer parts M onto part J. So there's, I think, 6 part M parts on the board. You only need 4 of them. So we're going to pop those out of the board, and you can remove any little hairs of plywood that are left over. So we're going to do the 2 slots at the top and the 2 slots at the bottom of part J. And again, these go on to the marked side, the side that has the off and the on markings on it. So we'll press each of the 4 pieces into the 4 corners. That's the second one. And number 3. Just make sure we've got enough glue there. And the 4th part. Before you move on, just double check that all the parts are fully pressed in and square to part J. Next up is the lever. In step 18, we're going to glue together parts N, O, and P. So go ahead and pop those out of the carrier board. So we're going to glue to the back and to the front of the larger piece. And you can make sure that the marked sides get hidden. So just apply a little bit of glue here. And that's going to go onto the marked side. And just make sure the edges are all nice and lined up before the glue sets. and you want to make sure that it's marked side up. There's a little index mark at the bottom of that gear. So apply a little bit of glue to the back here. And you apply glue to this part so that you don't get glue squeezing out into the lattice work from the other part and showing through the front. So again, make sure everything's aligned while you press this together. And there you go. Lever's done. If you want to finish your kit, now's a good time to do it. I've used butcher block oil or teak oil for a nice easy wood finish, or acrylic paints with a gesso base for more brighter colors. Whichever way you go, make sure that you're not applying any paint to the surfaces that are going to be glued in the steps that follow, or at least you're going to have to sand those edges before you continue gluing. Now we're going to move on to the final assembly. Step 20, we're going to place the cam follower and the lever onto part J. So you want to make sure that you're marked side up. So there's an index mark at the top of the cam follower. Make sure that's showing. And similarly on the lever, make sure that it's marked side up. So with the index mark showing. And you're going to align the index marks on the lever and the cam follower and place them on their axles. Next, you're going to glue the faceplate onto the parts M. So be careful here that you don't get any glue onto either the lever or the cam follower, because that will seize your switch. So just a little bit of glue. You want to make sure you're using enough to get a good solid bond, but you don't want it running everywhere. And now we'll snap the faceplate into place. And so there's a marked side on this as well. You want the marked side up. And it just presses right onto those parts M. And there's little indicator arrows in the slots at the top showing where to place those parts M. Make sure it's all the way on, and double check that the switch actually operates with it glued together, so that you haven't got any glue on any of the parts that move. Next, I'm going to place the actuator against the back of part J. So the part should align, and the axle, the round axle part, should fit through the cam follower. To hold this all together, we're going to glue the retainer on. And we just want to use a little bit of glue here. So that's part T. And this is a point where if you get too much glue here and it squeezes out, it can seize the switch. So we're going to be very cautious here and remove a little of the excess glue. I'm just using one of the excess parts from the kit to just move the glue around and make sure it's not going to squeeze out. So after you press part T on, oops, I didn't give it quite enough time to bond there. So I'm just going to realign the parts and put it back together. And hold it here while it bonds. And I just want to move the switch back and forth and work the parts to make sure that no glue got on the slot or any of the adjoining parts, and that the switch can move smoothly. And you can see just working it back and forth here a few times, everything seems to be just fine. Step 24, now we can glue the actuator plate onto the mounting box. So we're going to apply glue to all the edges of the mounting box here, and just work your way around. And you can use a healthy amount of glue here If a little does squeeze out, it doesn't touch any of the moving parts, and it provides a good bond. So you don't want to use too much, but this is a fairly safe step. And it doesn't really matter which way you put them together. You can have any orientation of the mounting box and the front plate. Just make sure that it sits firmly and all the tabs are fully in the notches. So just keep wiggling it and squeezing it until all the parts are fully pressed together. And there you have it. The kit's completed and ready to install. Whether you've built this kit for a toggle switch or a rocker switch, we've created the installation video to help you get it mounted to the wall. You can check out those links below.